My name is Lise Grande, and I'm the United Nations Resident Coordinator and the Resident Representative for the United Nations Development Program. As the head of the 28 United Nations agency funds and programs that have the privilege of working in India, we are honored to welcome you here to the third United Nations public lecture. It's my privilege to warmly welcome Dr. Pachauri, the Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute and the chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to deliver a lecture on climate change and sustainable energy for all. We are also joined on the podium by Ayumi Fujino, who is the Director for UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization here in India. Today's lecture is about two of the most important issues facing the world today: climate change and sustainable energy. These are both issues which have to be addressed by all of the countries in the world, and in the view of the United Nations, they're issues which have to be addressed very quickly. In terms of climate change, the longer we take to address the problem, the higher the risk we face, and the more money we're going to have to spend to deal with the problems created by it. Many of us here today are certainly aware that the people who are bearing the brunt of climate change and paying the highest costs already are some of the poorest people living in some of the world's poorest countries. Because of climate change and the havoc wreaked by it, poor people in Africa, in Asia, and the Americas are being forced into further destitution and impoverishment. This is wholly unfair. Poor people have contributed the least to the problem. They have the least capacity to adapt and manage the risks created by climate change, and yet they are the ones who are bearing the highest cost. In terms of sustainable energy, this too is a top global priority and has been singled out by the UN Secretary General as one of his major global campaigns. The Secretary General's campaign focuses on 4 A's. Energy has to be accessible, available, and affordable for all people, most importantly for poor people. There also has to be accountability in the system so that people know their needs are being met and can do something about it if they're not. In India right now, the 4 A's aren't yet in place. That's why the UN family here, under the leadership of UNIDO, is drawing attention to the 4 A's, to the importance of accessibility, availability, affordability, and accountability. It's clear that a lot is being done across the country on all 4 of the A's already. In Gujarat, electricity has been extended all the way to the remote villages. Similar things are being done in other states as well. It's particularly welcome that the government of India has said that energy is one of the country's very top priorities and has announced a national energy policy that will focus on generating power through both conventional and non-conventional sources. We now have the honor of inviting Dr. Pachauri to deliver the UN public lecture. Dr. Pachauri is a leading expert and global leader on energy, climate change, and sustainable development. He has served as the distinguished chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change since 2002, and in that capacity received the Nobel Prize in 2007, along with former Vice President of the US, Al Gore. Dr. Pachauri was the recipient of India's Padma Bhushan Award in 2001 and the Padma Vibhushan Award in 2008. Dr. Pachauri has led TERI since 1982 and is also the Chancellor of TERI University. Under his leadership, TERI has become one of the most eminent think tanks in the world. Dr. Pachauri heads numerous national and international committees and has authored more than 130 papers and 30 books. As a man of many parts, Dr. Pachauri writes poetry and fiction and plays cricket, and I feel honored to say is a very good and beloved friend. Dr. Pachauri.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that very generous introduction. I did make a note of the fact that you referred to me as the distinguished chairman of the IPCC. May I say, some would have preferred for me to be the extinguished chairman of the IPCC. But I'm here, and it's a great privilege to deliver this talk. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to pay a tribute at the outset to the United Nations. It's an organization which often gets a lot of criticism, but I can tell you, globally, it's the only show in town. And whatever you may say, the UN has been a leader in a number of areas of enormous concern and value to human society. And the very fact that we have today a program called Sustainable Energy for All, which has been articulated and led by the Secretary General of the UN, clearly is a mark of tribute to this absolutely outstanding organization. The fact that we had the Millennium Development Goals, which certainly brought to the fore the importance of doing away with poverty globally, is also an indicator of how important it is to have the United Nations and to lead the affairs of human society through the medium of the United Nations. Now, energy, may I say, was unfortunately one of those subjects which was not included in the Millennium Development Goals. Some of us on the outside tried very hard to see that it gets its due place in the Millennium Development Goals. Because as I would like to suggest, you really cannot eradicate poverty unless you deal with the crucial subject of energy. But at that stage, there were certain winds that were in force that clearly took the position that energy is something that the market will solve, and we don't have to include it as part of the Millennium Development Goals. And given the fact that the UN functions largely on consensus, we had the MDGs without energy, which in a sense remains the missing MDG. Now, going back in time, the importance of energy can hardly be overemphasized. Our ancestors, thousands and thousands of years ago, were perhaps startled by beginning a small fire, which became an important part of human existence. Because in the absence of fire, we wouldn't have been able to keep the cold out in our shelters, in our dwellings. In the absence of fire, we wouldn't have been able to cook all the things that we have now become accustomed to consume. And most importantly, if you go back in time, all movement of human beings from one place to the other was essentially dependent on muscle power. If it wasn't our own muscle power, it was the muscle power of animals and other agencies. Even when it came to shipping, essentially we were dependent on the wind, and this of course had to be manipulated by human action. So the point I'd like to make is that energy in its various forms has been such an intimate part of human existence that not to have given it primacy in everything that we did in terms of policies, in terms of strategies that we planned for in the future, would really have been a major exclusion. And now, of course, we have the issue of climate change, which to a large extent has been caused by the pattern of energy consumption that human society has followed essentially since the beginning of industrialization. And I want to tell you about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I have the privilege of chairing. It came into existence in 1988 as a body established by UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. And its existence was ratified by the UN General Assembly. Now, the way we function is that we mobilize the best scientists from all over the world who really devote their time and their talent for no payment at all from the IPCC. I mean, the IPCC has a very small and lean secretariat of barely a dozen people whose job it is to sort of keep the process going. And we function with a very modest budget of barely $10 million a year. And a large part of it really goes into providing support for travel and per diem, etc., for developing country authors, developing country functionaries of the IPCC. And we're very fortunate to really get the best talent from all over the world, which is volunteered, as I mentioned, on the basis of what you might call the labor of love. We brought out 4 assessment reports, and we are now in the concluding stages of the 5th assessment report. In addition, we have brought out a large number of special reports, and all of these are peer-reviewed, not only by experts from everywhere in the world, and essentially an expert can volunteer to carry out an expert review, but we also have reviews of specific stages of the draft of any report by governments, all the governments of the world, 195 governments which are members of the IPCC. Please don't ask me to name them because I wouldn't remember. So I don't know my 195 bosses. I am just a servant of this intergovernmental panel. Let me plunge into what I was going to tell you. Well, to start with, we need to understand the definition of sustainable development, which has been voiced and articulated across the globe. But when it comes to its interpretation and application, I'm not too sure whether everyone who has read this definition really knows how to apply it. Well, this definition really was popularized by the Brundtland Commission, and it's very simple because it defines sustainable development as that which meets the needs of the present without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So anything we do today must, if it has to conform to the definition of sustainable development, must enable us to meet our needs today, but it should be done in a manner that does not compromise or take away from the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, energy, of course, is extremely important as part of sustainable development because it lies at the heart of all countries and their core interests. Energy leads to job creation, economic development, security concerns, full empowerment of women. You know, even when it comes to law and order and security, why do cities place a focus on lighting up the streets, lighting up some of the most difficult areas, some of the slums of a city, simply because that has a direct impact on creating law and order and security as a condition. In September 2011, it was the UN Secretary General who launched his Sustainable Energy for All initiative. And the intention was to involve all spheres of society, business, government, civil society, community groups, academia, and everybody really. And the intention is to make sustainable energy for all a reality by 2030 by working in partnership. You really need to create these linkages and partnerships across all stakeholder groups, because this is not something that government alone can do. It requires every element of human society to get involved in this major mission. And it's been said by the UN Secretary General, energy is the golden thread that connects economic growth, increased social equity, and an environment that allows an environment that allows the world to thrive. Now, the reality, which in some respects is very unfortunate, nearly 1 in 5 on the planet lacks access to electricity, and there are almost 3 billion people who rely on wood, coal, charcoal, or animal waste for cooking and heating. Now, this is a very unfortunate situation because those who don't have access to electricity or modern forms of fuels have no choice but to use some of the poorest forms of material that can be used for combustion, and that leads to a substantial amount of emissions of various gases that are extremely harmful to the health of the people that are exposed. Now, again, may I say this is an area where, unfortunately, we have not really focused on the health impacts of this totally unsustainable form of energy that is prevalent across the globe, mainly in the developing countries. And I want to mention that my institute, TERI, is now trying very hard to get into a research program that would connect the impacts of the environment on human health and the impacts of climate change on human health. And I'll say a little more about that later. So this clearly remains a major barrier to eradicating poverty and building shared prosperity. Why? Because, if it has health impacts which are harmful, clearly that's not going to promote human welfare. If the woman in a household has to walk several kilometers just to get a headload of fuel wood, which is essentially in the form of twigs and very inferior biomass, then you cannot expect such a family to be in a state of well-being. Because look at the drudgery, the amount of human energy that is wasted in just collecting enough fuel wood to be able to cook 1 or 2 square meals a day. And of course, climate change is an important aspect, and I'll of course be saying much more on this subject, because where modern energy services are plentiful, the problem is waste and pollution. There are some countries in the world that, for instance, are emitting 60 tons per capita of greenhouse gases a year. And anthropogenic emissions are contributing to climate change, that's human-induced emissions. And this has impacts on lives, communities, infrastructure, institutions, and of course on budgets. And climate change impacts the poor, the first, and the worst. We've just heard that from the distinguished leader of the UN in India. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, not only in terms of government policies and actions, but also in our own daily lives and our own habits and lifestyles. Now, achieving the 3 objectives of what constitutes sustainable energy for all will maximize development benefits and help stabilize climate change over the long run. So what has been articulated as the 3 elements of sustainable energy for all, may I say, has a substantial amount of intelligence and wisdom behind it, because the objectives are complementary. So the key to both challenges is to provide sustainable energy for all, and Energy for All has focused on attaining 3 objectives. What are they? Ensure universal access to modern energy services, double the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix, and this is up to the year 2030, double the global rate of improvements in energy efficiency. Now, globally, energy efficiency has been improving, but the intention as part of SE for All is to see that by 2030, we double the rate at which improvements in energy efficiency take place. And I'll say a little more on this in the context of climate change. In order to define actions that need to be taken, the vision of SE for All has been broken down into 11 action areas, and these are listed over here. I don't have to go into them. So the point I'd like to make is that these 3 broad objectives of SE for All have been translated into specific actions which constitute 11 areas where action is required. Now, the 11 action areas address almost 95% of global energy consumption, key components of productive energy use, and the supporting mechanisms that are needed. So it's a very comprehensive program. What is really difficult, and that's where the challenge lies, is to see that all stakeholders, all sections of society are allocated a role and are given a specific mission that becomes part of this sustainable energy for all that the UN Secretary General has launched. All right, sustainable energy has enormous benefits. It enables businesses to grow because, let's face it, I can give you several examples. If you look at the countries in the Nordic region, they were perhaps the first to focus on improvements in energy efficiency in buildings. What did that lead to? Well, it led to the production of windows that are far more efficient, the way they've been designed, the way they provide insulation. It led to a team of engineers becoming energy auditors because they could go out and measure energy consumption in various establishments and tell you exactly how you could bring about savings in an economically viable way. At the same time, there's been an expansion of use of renewable energy supply, and that has led to jobs. So it generates jobs. It creates new markets. Children can study after dark. And, you know, I was very touched. I went to one of the villages where we have implemented our Lighting a Billion Lives campaign, and I'll say a little more at the end on that campaign, which we launched essentially in 2008, although it was highlighted in the Clinton Global Initiative in 2007. Well, what I found was that you had these children sitting inside a mosquito net on their beds and doing their homework. And they said that they couldn't do this earlier, simply because if you have a kerosene lantern, you dare not sit in bed and do your homework in the light of that lantern, because suppose it spills over, you would have a fire and, you know, everything would be gone. But with a solar lantern, which is part of our Lighting a Billion Lives campaign, you're totally safe, you're totally secure. There's no combustion taking place anywhere. There's no fuel of any kind. The fuel is the sun, which is just so far away that you don't even know how far it is. And therefore, this is a very safe, a very secure, and a sustainable form of energy supply. Clinics can store life-saving vaccines. You know, this is one of the biggest handicaps that we have in spreading healthcare in a country like India. Where do you store those vaccines? Where do you store all the medicines that require refrigeration? My institute has a presence in a place called Mukteshwar in Uttarakhand. And Mukteshwar was very well known for an institute that the British set up perhaps 150 years ago, which is a branch of the Indian Veterinary Research Institute. And the reason why it was set up in that climate was because you could store serum, you could store vaccines in that location, in the weather that existed over there. But in the absence of refrigeration, which requires energy, you can't do that in the villages in India. But now that you have renewable sources of energy, you can have decentralized refrigeration, which would enable storage. Countries can grow more resilient. They can develop competitive economies, because look at the coal-based energy supply in this country. By the time you can serve the 300 million odd people who don't have access to electricity, just look at the major investments that would be required, all the losses that are involved in transmission and distribution. To give you an indicator, I carried out a very quick back of the envelope calculation. If you look at the amount of coal that is mined and the energy that a farmer gets, let's say, in a remote part of this country, in terms of the irrigation by irrigation pumping of groundwater and then getting it to the field, that 100 tons of coal that is burnt, of that 1 ton reaches the farmer's field. So there is such a huge amount of loss at various stages of the cycle that, to my mind, that's clearly a very wasteful approach. And today we have the benefit of renewable energy technology, which, if you take all the costs and all the benefits into account, is clearly a winner in economic terms. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the findings of the IPCC fifth assessment report and why it is important that we look at energy within the context of what can be done to deal with the challenge of climate change. Well, limiting climate change will require sustained and substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Why? Because total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have been growing, and significantly, they have continued to increase over the period 1970 to 2010. I just want to tell you that in 2010, the world emitted, human society emitted 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gases. 49 gigatons. What was the figure in the year 2000? 39 gigatons. That means in 10 years, we have increased 10 gigatons of emissions. Each year, we've added an average of 1 gigaton of emissions. So clearly, we are on a path where emissions of greenhouse gases continue to increase. And this, despite the fact that it was in 1992 that the world accepted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you have to ask yourself, is this a commentary on successful implementation of something that's enshrined as a global agreement? The answer, of course, is obvious. Now, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes contributed about 78% of the total greenhouse gas emission increase between 1970 and 2010. So this is a sector that we need to focus on. These are two sectors on which we need to focus. And about half of the cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions between 1750, that means the beginning of, or the before industrialization, and 2010 have occurred in the last 40 years. So you take this long period of time from 1750 to 2010, the total emissions that were created in that period, well, half of it has come in the last 40 years. And in baseline scenarios, direct CO2 emissions from the energy supply sector are projected to double or triple by 2050 compared to 2010. So if we move on business as usual, then clearly we are really going to double or triple our total emissions of CO2 from the energy sector in particular. And there have to be, therefore, very substantial improvements in energy efficiency and therefore a reduction in energy intensity of growth. Now, what have we found in the IPCC fifth assessment report? 3 working group reports have come out. We are now working on the synthesis report, which comes out at the end of October. There's a 95% certainty that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the middle of the 20th century. Now, this is up from 90%, which is what we said in 2007 in the fourth assessment report. So today, scientifically, we have much higher confidence that it is human activities that have been responsible for the change in climate that has taken place since the middle of the last century. 95% certainty. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. And human influence has been detected in warming of the atmosphere and the ocean, in changes in the global water cycle, in reductions in snow and ice, in global mean sea level rise, and in changes in some climate extremes. Well, almost exactly a month ago, I was in the Arctic region. This is a place which is 79 degrees north, which is supposed to be the northernmost permanent settlement. It's a research establishment, an international research establishment in a place called Ny-Ålesund. I've been there 3 times. I've been once to Greenland. But in the Arctic region, you can almost see the changes that are taking place. And you would get tears in your eyes when you see pieces of ice from the glaciers that you have over there falling into the ocean. And you see that in the course of just a few minutes. It's happening continuously. So you can imagine what havoc we are playing into the ecosystem of that very rare region in this world. If you look at changes in global average upper ocean heat content, a large part of the heat that is being generated by climate change is now being absorbed by the oceans. And it's gone down to a level of 700 meters, and it's sinking lower and lower. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished all over the globe. Sea level has risen. The concentration of greenhouse gases have increased. If you look at global average sea level rise, then between the year 1900 and 2010, the increase has been an average of 19 centimeters. You just have to go to an island nation like the Maldives, and if you tell them that 19 centimeters, which is close to a foot, is what the sea level rise has been, there's obviously going to be consternation. There's going to be fear, there's going to be concern, simply because a large part of that nation is barely a meter above sea level. And I remember in 1997, when I was elected as vice chairman of the IPCC, the plenary session of the IPCC took place in the Maldives, and the then president, Gayoom, stood before us, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding this conference 7 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water. Because you don't have to wait till that whole area gets submerged. Bangladesh gets submerged, or the small island states in the Pacific get submerged. But well before that, every time there's a storm surge, every time there's coastal flooding, you will have a threat to life and property in those locations. If you look at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, they have grown to unprecedented levels. In fact, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the past 800,000 years. You would ask, how do you know that's the case? Well, if you go to a place like Greenland, which is a mountain of ice 3 kilometers high, you see nothing but ice. You almost feel you're on a different planet. And when we went in a US Air Force plane, which didn't land on wheels, it landed on skis. And in fact, that very plane took a while to take off, because every time it went to the end of the runway, they found the snow conditions were not suitable for takeoff, simply because it had just snowed at that point of time, and the ice had not quite formed. It hadn't settled in. The point I'm making is you drill over there, and the deeper you go, the older are the ice cores that you actually find. Because, as this keeps getting covered with ice, you have older and older layers of ice at the bottom. So depending on the depth you go, you can tell the actual age of the ice that's over there, and then you measure the content of the air that is trapped inside those slices of ice, and you can find out exactly what the carbon dioxide, the methane, and other contents were 800,000 years ago. So the ocean has absorbed about 30% of the total anthropogenic carbon dioxide that's been emitted, and as a result, the oceans are acidifying. Now, the impact of that on the coral reefs, on marine ecosystems, on marine species, is something that we really don't know enough about, but we need to find out very quickly, because it has major implications on all forms of life on the planet. These are the sources from which emissions of greenhouse gases take place. You can see electricity is a major contributor. AFO-LU, which gives you about 24%, is agriculture, forestry, and land use. So this is a sector which has perhaps not received the kind of attention it deserves, but it's a major source of emissions. On the right-hand side, you have indirect CO2 emissions, and these are, for instance, industry gets a lot of raw material, and in the process of the upstream supply of raw materials, there are emissions of greenhouse gases, so that can be attributed to the industry, in the sector of industry, transport, buildings, and so on. Okay, now, it's very likely that it's not just an increase in temperature that climate change is all about. There's also been an increase in the length, frequency, and/or intensity of warm spells or heat waves. In fact, under some scenarios, we have projected that by the end of the century, a 1 in 20-year hottest day is likely to become a 1 in 2-year event in most regions. So that means heat waves are going to become, and I know I'm striking a sympathetic chord by saying that. You've seen the kinds of temperatures we've experienced recently, but heat waves, some heat waves, which come once in 20 years, will by the end of this century come once in 2 years. So we have to be prepared for that. And it's likely that the frequency of heavy precipitation or the proportion of total rainfall from heavy falls will increase over most areas of the globe. So much so that even in those locations where you have a reduction in average rainfall, most of it will occur in the form of very heavy rainfall. Okay, let me just run quickly through some of the risks that we have, particularly in Asia. Water scarcity is going to be a major challenge. Higher temperatures can lead to lower rice yields, and there's growing evidence on the impacts of climate change on agriculture, which is largely negative. Sea level rise will inundate low-lying areas and especially affect rice-growing regions. Coastal and marine systems are under increasing stress from climatic and non-climatic drivers, and damage to coral reefs will increase during the 21st century. And the damage is already evident all over the world, with warming as well as acidification of the oceans. There'd be adverse effects on sustainable development capabilities of most Asian developing countries because it will aggravate pressures on natural resources and the environment. And please remember that a large part of ecosystem services really go to the benefit of the poorest of the poor. Because what do they depend on? What do they survive on? The services that you get from nature, from ecosystems that we take for granted. Increasing impact of extreme events on human health, security, livelihoods, and poverty, with the type and magnitude of impact varying across Asia. So it's not uniform, but I just want to make a statement. There is no part of the world that would remain untouched by the impacts of climate change. This is something that's becoming increasingly clear. And sustained mass loss of ice sheets, this could cause larger sea level rise, sustained warming greater than some threshold, greater than, say, about 1 degree Celsius, but less than 4 degrees global mean warming, would lead to the near complete loss of the Greenland ice sheet over a millennium or more. Of course, it won't happen overnight, but it could happen over a millennium or more, causing global mean sea level rise of up to 7 meters. So my advice to those who believe in reincarnation is that please pray that if you were to get reincarnated, you get reincarnated soon, when this planet is still livable. If you come 1,000 years later, God knows what things would be like. So that's something to keep in mind. And there are limits to resilience when thresholds or tipping points associated with social or natural systems are exceeded. There are some who believe, oh, well, we can always adapt to the impacts of climate change. I was in this place, Longyear Bend, which is 78 degrees north at the northern tip of Norway. And we had this mustachioed former captain of the Norwegian army who was driving us around. And he said, what's the problem? 2 degrees more temperature, we'll be fine. I'd love to get 2 or 3 degrees higher temperature. So, some believe that we can adapt to the impacts of climate change. And on one occasion, I was going through immigration in the US, and this immigration officer asked me what I was doing. I tried to explain to him. He said, you're talking about climate change? And this was in the month of May. He said, just snowed yesterday in New York. So then I had to spend a little time trying to explain to him what climate change is all about. He said, okay, go. He stamped my passport and said. So anyway, that's the way life is. I think people have to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. Okay, what I want to say is that we will reach certain tipping points, we will reach certain thresholds beyond which adapting to climate change will not be possible. And therefore, we have to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases, but we also have to adapt because there's a certain inertia in the system as a result of which climate change will continue for several decades. And we better be prepared for it. whether it's in agriculture, which may require changes in cropping patterns and practices, or human health, where if we're going to deal with heat waves, we're going to deal with extreme precipitation, I think we have to be prepared for it. So, in every aspect of life, the impacts of climate change are going to make it necessary for us to adapt to them. But we would reach the limits of adaptation, and therefore it's also important that we reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, by which we limit the extent to which the climate is going to change. And therefore, what we need, as is said over here, is climate resilient pathways require both adaptation and mitigation. Okay, now what is it that we need to do? The most effective strategies offer development benefits in the near term. Whatever we do for climate change really has a whole range of co-benefits. For instance, if you look at any sector of the economy, whether it's agriculture or, dealing with disasters and emergency, or for that matter, in management of water resources. If we are going to get a much more scarce availability of water, then clearly we have to manage every drop more efficiently. And this really means that we've got to bring about change in our institutions as well. Now, effective risk management and adaptation are tailored to local and regional needs and circumstances. So may I say that while mitigation is something you have to do at the global level, and of course everyone has to get involved, adaptation is essentially something that's rooted in local communities, local governments, and you have to create conditions by which locally society can adapt and deal with the impacts of climate change. So that's because changes in climate extremes vary across regions. Each region has unique vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards. What would be hazardous, let's say, in the mountain areas of the Himalayan range would be very different from what you find, let's say, in coastal areas. So, the adaptation measures that are designed and are suitable for a particular location are totally dependent on what happens in that particular location. Now, you will be told that, the cost of mitigation is very high. We're going to lose jobs. We're going to lose economic output. The evidence is quite to the contrary, because we've estimated if you want to limit temperature increase to, say, below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, then the cost of mitigation in 2030 will amount to no more than a 1.7% loss in global consumption. So you could say, that's the reduction in global GDP that would take place. Well, there are also huge co-benefits. What are the co-benefits? Firstly, you would have much higher energy security. You would have lower levels of pollution at the local level. You would probably generate many more jobs. You would certainly have much higher agricultural output. So if you take the sum total of that, and the fact that you're avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change, then this is clearly a winner. This 1.7% reduction in GDP will be more than offset with all the benefits that you get from the actions that are required. And if we want to limit temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, what's required is lower global greenhouse gases in 2050 than in 2010. So that means we had 49 gigatons of emissions in 2010. We need to bring it down to much lower by 2050. So 2050 will have to have a lower figure, 40% to 70% lower globally. Emissions level near 0 gigatons of CO2 equivalent or below in 2100. So if we want to keep within that 2-degree increase in temperature, then by the end of this century, the world cannot be emitting greenhouse gases anywhere. So you have to come to 0 or negative values. You would say that's impossible. No, it's not impossible, because you could have a large amount of renewable sources of energy. You could expand forestry. You could cut down on deforestation. You could have carbon capture and storage. So there are technological options that would make it possible, and we have the time, but we don't have the luxury of time. We've got to start now. We've got to put in place policies by which we get those outcomes by the end of the century. We'll need more rapid improvements in energy efficiency, which is part of SE for all. We need a tripling to nearly a quadrupling of the share of zero and low carbon energy supply from renewables by 2050. Now, here again, the sustainable energy for all goals are right on target, because by 2030, you're talking about doubling the share of renewables. By 2050, you'll have to treble or quadruple that quantity. And what are the options for energy supply? Nuclear energy, biomass, fossil energy with carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage by the year 2050. So this is the agenda that we have for action to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. And we've looked at various scenarios. Of course, there are several carbon reduction technologies, carbon dioxide reduction technologies, but these at the current point of time are uncertain. Therefore, you've got to put in place policies. You've got to possibly have a price on carbon by which there's a market signal for producers and consumers alike. We would need to decarbonize electricity generation. Renewable energy technologies are an option. Nuclear energy could be an option. The replacement of world average coal-fired power plants with modern natural gas combined cycle power plants, carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. All of these entail challenges and risks, but human society has the ability and the wherewithal to make this happen. I'm not going into the details over here. We would need interventions in industry, transport, buildings. Buildings is an area where a country like India really cannot afford to neglect inefficient buildings being constructed, because as everybody says, most of the buildings that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. As it happens, renewable energy technologies are reaching the point where they can compete effectively with conventional sources of energy supply. If you look at this diagram, on the left-hand side, there's a band which gives you the cost of conventional energy, but the long bars that you see over here give you the costs of renewable sources of energy. And you can see there's an overlap. There are several applications in which renewable energy is already competing effectively. And this is particularly true in decentralized applications, as I'll show you in a minute. Now, mitigation and adaptation with other societal goals have to be matching. If well managed, this can strengthen the basis for undertaking climate action. Improved energy efficiency and security go hand in hand. Cleaner energy sources will make the planet much cleaner. Air quality will improve. Human health will benefit. Reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas will be required. Sustainable production, sustainable agriculture and forestry. Protection of ecosystems for carbon storage. So these are some of the areas where we need to focus in the future that will give us both mitigation and adaptation options. Now, a stable climate is one component of sustainable development. Of course, there are natural variations in the climate that we can't do anything about, and human society has dealt with them since time immemorial. But limiting the effects of climate change is necessary to achieve sustainable development and equity, including poverty eradication. And designing an effective climate policy involves mainstreaming climate in the design of sustainable development strategies. Options for equitable burden sharing can reduce the potential for the costs of climate action to constrain development. So the point I'd like to make is that climate change has now to be integrated in development policy overall. And this has to be done in every part of the world. Now, I want to give you just a small example of a program that we launched in 2008 called Lighting a Billion Lives. We implement it through a variety of ways. One of them is one where we have in a village a woman who's trained to charge all the solar lanterns in that village using a solar panel on her roof. She charges them during the daytime and rents them out at night. And of course, she gets paid for the use of those lanterns and gets them back in the daytime in the morning. Another model is to use a small microgrid, let's say 20 households being connected by a microgrid with a solar panel that essentially supplies the electricity to these 20 households. That gives you enough lighting using an LED system, gives you a little bit of electricity to run an improved cook stove, because in that cook stove you have a forced draft for which electricity is required. Now, just to give you a rough example, for these 20 households, the total investment required would be about 80,000 rupees. And each household willingly pays about 5 rupees a day for the lighting and the little bit of electricity for an improved cook stove. So that works out to about 3,000 rupees a month for the 20 households, and it works out to 36,000 rupees a year. So that means the 80,000 rupee investment can be recovered in a little more than 2 years. So it's a totally viable opportunity. But what we really need to do is to create entrepreneurs in villages. We need to create some technical skills by which this will actually get implemented. And the point I'd like to make is that for people to promise villages that we'll give you electricity, and you know what happens when electricity is provided to villages. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, you have a totally unreliable and totally unstable power supply. But with this, there is every opportunity to use renewable energy on a large scale. There are other options like biomass gasification. Some places there might even be wind. Our Prime Minister did something very innovative in Gujarat. He's covered all the canals with photovoltaic panels. And he spoke here at the India Habitat Center about 2 months ago, and he mentioned in response to a question the several benefits from this kind of approach. Well, firstly, you don't have to buy land because the canals are there. The space is available to the government. You cover the canals with photovoltaic panels. Secondly, you reduce evaporation because you've got a cover on the canals. Thirdly, because of the lower temperature of the panel, because there's water below it, the performance of the photovoltaic panels improves. And finally, since you have electricity and generally habitation by a canal, people can get electricity very easily from the photovoltaic sources covering the canal. So anyway, there's a whole range of options. All we need is training. All we need is some innovation. And one of my colleagues who's working on this program, Debajit, is here. We are getting close to 3,000 villages in India, and we're working in Africa. And I think it's very important to practice sustainable energy for all. It's not just a slogan. It's something for which you need to innovate and find solutions. And it is within our reach to do that. The pity is, as I mentioned, 1.3 billion people lack access to electricity. 360 million live in India. 2.2 billion liters of kerosene burnt each year for lighting in this country. And about 5.5 tons of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere by burning kerosene for this. This is what is the case in a household. So there is a major benefit in moving to renewable sources of energy. These are just some pictures from our Lighting a Billion Lives campaign. And finally, I want to remind you of what Mahatma Gandhi said. The technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. We are prone to self-deception. When we find it convenient, we don't want to take some action beyond the ordinary, we deceive ourselves that everything is fine. But a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. He also said, very wisely, you know, the whole world is so focused on GDP growth. We don't look at the implications of the type of GDP growth that we are pursuing. Therefore, he rightly said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. we need, well, you wouldn't believe that on the roads of Delhi, because often you see a motorcyclist or some car coming in the wrong direction on the opposite side of the road. To him, speed is relevant, even if he's going in the wrong direction. But Gandhiji meant it in an aggregate sense. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much. I'll be very happy to answer any questions. All I want to say is that we clearly need a new regime as far as energy is concerned. I don't want to raise any alarms, but frankly, I am a little concerned about the growing dependence on oil imports of this country. We, several years ago, made a presentation to the then Prime Minister on energy security, and we highlighted where we were going on a business as usual path by 2030. Today, there is some added concern with what is happening, for instance, in Iraq. Now, we can say that we are getting oil from Basra in Iraq, which is in the southern region, but who knows what will happen there tomorrow. So I think we need to be very concerned about all the implications of the current pattern of energy growth and supply, and therefore we certainly need to focus on sustainable energy for all, because it has a whole range of benefits. It's also an important element of what is required to deal with the challenge of climate change. Thank you very much.
What we'll do in this part of the lecture is to take 3 or 4 questions at once, and then Dr. Pachauri will respond to those, and then we'll take a second round, and if we have time, we'll take a third round. So for the first round, sir, I saw you, the gentleman with the glasses in the back. If I may have your question, and I'll work this side first. So, sir, you'll be second, sir, third, and ma'am, fourth, if we could go in that order.
I am H.S. Sharma from IIT Bombay, first batch. My question to you, sir, would you like to comment nuclear explosions, hundreds of million tons were used by different countries, the main reason for global warming? Did you have any insight? Hundreds of millions of tons of huge energy was exploded in our Earth. Number 1 question. Number 2, any comment, the temperature according to calculation will rise by 8 degrees, not by 2 degrees, because snow in Siberia is melted, underneath is vegetation which is emitting methane, having a global warming potential of 25 as against 1 of CO2. So neither the potato will grow nor the wheat. We'll have to survive by bananas. And last, my observation on ground reality of solar, why it is not taking off in our country. It is funded by NABARD, refinanced. There are local banks, like Gurgaon Gramin Bank for Haryana. They finance. The villager comes, picks up 60,000 worth of panels and other items, goes back, Gurgaon Gramin Bank signs an agreement, you pay 600 rupees per month. He gives only twice, 2 months. Then he comes, I am SC/ST, I am a Muslim, I am OBC, I should get it free. And he does not pay. This is the main reason. Thank you.
Sir.
You see, as you rightly said, climate change and global warming, this is a man-made phenomenon. We are responsible for it. So the more of us on Earth, the more contribution will be our contribution to climate change. So I would like to ask you to comment on the contribution of population explosion on this problem, and also what do you think is the limit of human beings, number of human beings that this Earth can sustain, and what in your opinion needs to be done?
Sir.
My name is Dr. Priyaranjan Trivedi. I'm the Chancellor at the Indira Gandhi Technological and Medical University of Arunachal Pradesh. We have brought out an encyclopedia of global warming reduction and climate change management, which is being circulated to all the universities. we wish to inform you that our all cooperation will be available to Dr. Pachauri. Thank you.
Sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pachauri. I have the privilege of knowing him for, I think, quite some time, 2-3 decades. I think we have traveled some distance in terms of promoting renewable energy. I would just like to raise 2 pointed questions. One, have you made any assessment of the work of the new ministry which has been created by the government of India in this? And in your view, in which direction it is going? You see, because that is something nearer home which will make sense to us. And secondly, what is the state of the art in terms of the solar energy? Because that is something which has a lot of potential in India. But I don't see much happening in that sector. Thank you.
And the last question in this round to Madam.
I'm Jyoti Parikh, Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRADE. Dr. Pachauri, thank you very much for a very delightful and interesting talk. You know, we say whatever climate, GHG emissions are emitted, some of it are absorbed by oceans, forests, rocks, and so on, called sink. So I was wondering, what is the sink capacity going down or remaining the same, or what have you found recently? Because we used to think that it absorbs 50% of what we emit. Of course, in the meantime, our emissions have gone up, and then if the sink capacities go down, then the difference between what's emitted and what accumulates gets larger. And second is a comment. We have good solutions for lighting, solar lighting and so on. But for cooking, we still, solar cooking is still not as prevalent as we thought it would be. Many times we used to, almost 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago, solar cooker was used to demonstrate, but it has not got as much promotion. And that's the one which requires, doesn't close, sorry. So in terms of the cooking solutions through solar or otherwise, and especially the business models are very important. We hear that people are designing improved cook stoves, but improved cook stoves also require wood fuels. So we were looking at some solutions like village wood lots managed by women, and then they solve the problem of fuel supply as well as fuel transport if it's in the village. So that is the kind of more examples I needed. Thank you.
Dr. Pachauri, if you'll take the first round, and then we'll come to a second round.
Sure. Well, let me answer the first set of questions on nuclear explosions. Well, they don't emit greenhouse gases. Nuclear explosions have a lot of negative implications, and I hardly think that that's an issue that anyone would dispute. I mean, we really have to do away with nuclear explosions of all kinds, and even the potential for these explosions. You mentioned an 8-degree increase in temperature. Well, in the IPCC, we have pursued 4 scenarios in the future, and one of them is essentially a do-nothing scenario and no mitigation. That would lead to a temperature increase of about 4.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And that's disaster, because if you get 4.8 degrees Celsius, I mean, if you look at the difference in average temperatures between the Ice Age and the interglacial periods, is between 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. So that clearly is something that the Earth and we human beings and other living species will not be able to tolerate. You talked about the impacts on agriculture. Yes, maybe we won't even have bananas. And if we do, then all we can say is that the world has gone bananas. All right. The issue of financing of solar, we've created such a soft society. You can get away with, any vote bank, any group can get away with anything that they want. And we find it politically expedient to say, "Theek hai, the loans can be waived." I hope the government that we have in office now will bring about a sea change in this soft approach that we followed. And the kinds of giveaways which in the end everybody pays for. There's no such thing as a free lunch. The population explosion, yes, population is a major driver of emissions of greenhouse gases, but that's precisely why we also need to be very careful about the way we use energy, the way we manage all our economic activities. And I think production and consumption patterns are an important part of emissions of greenhouse gases. And here again, I'd like to repeat an anecdote of Mahatma Gandhi's, which I've used on every occasion. When he was asked whether he wouldn't want India to reach the same level of prosperity as Britain, he says Britain reached its present level of prosperity by using half the resources of this planet. He says, if India has to reach the same level of prosperity, how many planets would a country like India require? So, we are a country of 1.2 billion plus people. We cannot blindly follow what, say, North America has pursued as a pattern of development. I mean, for our own sake, where are we going to get the resources from? Look at the level of pollution, look at the number of motor vehicles. Can we possibly even think of having half the number of motor vehicles per 1,000 population that, say, North America has? We've got to find other solutions. And we're a poor country. We need public transport. When I was questioned by the media before the Nano came out, what do you think about the Nano? And I said, well, I get nightmares at the thought of the Nano. And I said, I wish Mr. Tata was putting his efforts and his money into coming up with public transport solutions. Of course, it's another matter that Nano turned out to be na and no. So, anyway. Mehdi Saab, who's an old friend, he asked me a question about the new ministry. Well, unfortunately, every secretary who comes to that ministry, before he joins there, he's thinking of moving to another ministry. So, I think that gives you a satisfactory indication of what that poor ministry has been able to do so far. It's been in existence since the early 80s. But what has it achieved? I mean, I think it's sad. And Professor Trivedi, I'm very grateful for your offer of support. And I think all of us have to work together. And we have to join hands. Sorry? Well, I think solar energy is, despite the fact that there hasn't been adequate research and development, costs have come down to a surprisingly attractive level. But the one area where I think we really ought to be concentrating is solar thermal technologies. If you use concentrated solar production techniques, I think this country, particularly in Rajasthan and Gujarat and other parts where you have land and you've got very high levels of insulation, can become a major bank for supply of electricity. We ourselves and in TERI have carried out a feasibility study with the Clinton Climate Initiative of 2 major solar parks in Rajasthan and Gujarat, 4,000 megawatts each. Now, these will be massive, and they would basically use conventional power generation technology, but they would produce steam using concentrated solar technology. And I think this country has the opportunity to really become leaders in that technology. Spain is doing very well. They've got a few establishments which I've seen over there, in fact. So I think solar looks very promising. And again, may I say, this Prime Minister has been making a lot of statements in favor of solar. I expect, we have a Solar Energy Corporation of India, of which the Secretary of the Ministry is the chairman. The first chairman was Dr. Anil Kakodkar, but since his term expired, the Secretary of the Ministry has taken over. I hope it gets some stability. But that was set up through the initiative of and efforts of some of us outside the system, so that, it can really promote solar energy in a big way without going through all the bureaucratic encumbrances. So overall, I feel very bullish about solar, and I think this country has to emerge as the leader in solar technology. It would make a lot of sense if we were to do that. Dr. Jyoti Parikh's question, yes, the absorptive capacity of the earth is certainly going down. The oceans, as I mentioned, have absorbed 30% of the CO2 emitted since the beginning of industrialization. They can't keep absorbing all our sins forever. And the point was also made about the permafrost in Siberia and those regions. If that permafrost, let us say, was to melt, you would get a large quantity of emissions of methane and other gases. So I think we cannot take the absorptive capacity of the earth for granted. Deforestation is still taking place on a large scale, and the oceans, of course, can only absorb a certain amount. Who knows, at some stage, instead of being a sink, they could become net emitters. So I think it's time that we realize that you cannot continue to emit forever and see all the carbon dioxide being absorbed.
For the next round, we have the gentleman in the fourth row, the gentleman in the second row, and the gentleman in the third row here, and madam. Sir.
Solar and wind power energy is being used in foreign countries economically and sustainably. But in India, it is very expensive, and our consumers and farmers cannot afford to use solar energy at this rate, because the radiation, solar radiation frequency and the frequency of receiver, the natural frequency of the receiver, is mismatched, and we cannot use the energy. And this technology, TERI has not been able to develop. TERI is using only paperwork,
Sir?
publicity, and they should come down to the practical work so that technology reaches the ground level of the villages.
Sir.
This is important.
Thank you. And we had the gentleman in the second row.
Thank you very much, Professor Pachauri, for the very brilliant and enlightening letter. Several times you have underscored the ethical dimensions. I'm Dr. Merchant, trustee of the Baha'i Lotus Temple. And after all, it is human motivation that will ultimately decide whether we survive or we perish. So I wanted to find out, is there some way that IPCC can harness the resources of religious communities to provide this motivation and ensure that all these technological advances and technologies that are available are dovetailed, because they can provide motivation. There are more than 1,000 temples, 800 mosques, 600 gurdwaras, and umpteen number of other religious places in Delhi alone. So there was an initiative taken by Delhi government previously about cleanliness. So I would like to say that all the scientific advances will now have to be somehow also dovetail with the religious resources. And if there is some way each temple, mosque has some kind of a education program, then perhaps there'll be a much powerful motivation, because civilization is sustained by material as well as spiritual resources. So I once again thank you for your very brilliant presentation.
We have the gentleman in the third row here.
So thank you, sir, for a brilliant lecture. You almost presented a doomsday scenario, but of course you highlighted some of the mitigation and adaptation strategies also. If I have understood you correctly, it's the blind pursuit of growth and development that has contributed to the present day state of affairs. Do you think mankind would be better off if we reverted back to the lifestyle of our forefathers? Thank you, sir.
And we have Madam.
Thank you very much. I myself, Dr. Malti Goel, formerly advisor. Currently, I'm working on climate change and carbon sequestration. I would like to ask Dr. Pachauri, I'm very impressed about this Lighting a Billion Village program and benefits from the decentralized electrification. Sir, what do you think about the solar mega power plant vis-a-vis this billion, what will be the ecological implications of generating 4,000 megawatt solar photovoltaic power plant at one place, and how does it rate co-benefits?
And the final question in this round is Madam in the fourth row.
Hello, ma'am. It was a very innovative talk, and Dr. Pachauri has brought up so many good points in this, and I'm very happy. I'm Dr. Geeta Sharma from Delhi University, and I'm working on Eco Club activities also. Here I'm inducting with the reforestation one and control on desertification also. But simultaneously, I'm very happy that Dr. Pachauri has brought up that the solar panel has to be solar systems, and the solar energy has to be channelized for not only for villages but for urban areas also. But here my question is, like I'm a human being, everyone is living, sitting here, we are all gas bombs, aren't we? If we are every day, we are throwing so much gas, so much filth. How to recycle this? Can we? If it is so, similarly, individual factories, individual units, individual local areas, not in underdeveloped countries, but developing countries and developed countries also. I have actually visited America. I have seen that these areas, they are so vast, so open, due to which, they are comparatively pollution less, I should say, as compared to India. But I should say that the mounds of that biodegradable waste which we are emerging every day individually, that should be utilized somehow or the other,
Madam?
there and then, okay, to emerge out with energy. Thank you, dears.
Okay, the gentleman who talked about solar and wind and that people are not able to afford them. Well, I'm sorry to dispel this notion that you have, but in a number of decentralized applications, renewable energy is far cheaper than conventional sources. And you stated that Terry is only doing work on paper. Right now, I have a team of about 40 people working in temperatures of 50 degrees in Kuwait. We are carrying out a major project over there, cleaning up oil spills that Saddam Hussein created when he invaded Kuwait. And so I'd like to give you a cordial invitation. One of my colleagues will take you to one of the villages where we are working. And there are thousands of them where we have worked, and we're still working. And maybe then you'll come back and say that the 1,200 plus people who are in Terry are actually doing something useful. But I'm not here to defend my institution. All I would say, the point that you've made is valid. What is really going to help is storage technology. Because if we can come up with viable storage technology, and that's very likely, in the very near future, then solar and wind would become very attractive in different parts of the world. Because this is the limitation, whether it's wind or solar, the periodicity of the energy that you get really is a major limitation. So I think storage technology will certainly help. And that's round the corner, it's going to happen. The point on ethics is well taken. And in fact, in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, for the first time, we have brought in the ethical dimensions. And I think what you said is absolutely right. What you need is the leaders of every faith to highlight the importance of climate change and what we as human beings ought to do to deal with the problem. I've been trying very hard to get through to the Pope because he's very concerned about poverty all over the world. And one of the biggest threats to the poor in the world is climate change. And I would want him to make a statement on that, but I'm sorry, I haven't been able to get through the ring around him. Because the Vatican. So I hope I'll succeed, maybe with the help of my good friend Liz, because she's very influential. And I'm sure the Pope would listen to her. Yeah. If sinners like me can listen to her, the Pope certainly will. Right? Okay. Growth and development, yes. The pattern of growth and development that we are pursuing is not sustainable. I don't think we need to go back to the way our ancestors lived. I still feel this is a big nuisance, but I'd much rather have it than not have it. Okay? I think there are several aspects in which technology and developments that have taken place are now in some sense reversible. What we need to do is to internalize the cost that we're imposing in terms of externalities on the environment, on our natural resources. And I think it's within our ability to come up with a pattern of development that is harmless for the environment. And I think that's what the effort should be. We need a change in direction. We don't need to pursue the same pattern of growth. We need to bring about a reorientation. We've got Dr. Saxena over here, who has done so much in the field of rural development and worrying about poor societies across the globe. We also need a more equitable form of development. You know, the gap between rich and poor is really becoming abusive. It's becoming so terrible all over the world. It is obscene, you're right. So, you know, I think this is something, we talk about inclusive growth, but what do we do in terms of policies to bring in that element of inclusivity? We don't. So I think what we need is a reorientation of growth. Yeah, the issue of this solar power plant of 4,000 megawatts, you know, the big benefit of this particular possibility is that most of the fabrication will take place on site. It will be done in India. So the costs would be much lower than if we were to import the equipment, all the equipment from overseas. And there are economies of scale by which the cost per unit of power produced will be substantially lower. So I personally think this is a project worth doing. We'll gain so much from it by reducing costs, by gaining experience. The point about human beings being gas bombs, the waste that we have, I mean, I mentioned this in another location the other day. You know, you travel on the train from Delhi. On both sides, you see such a filthy mess. People who have dumped all kinds of muck all over the place. It's absolutely shameful. You know, I've been to Rishikesh on one occasion, well, a couple of occasions, and that whole area is so littered with filth. There is an ashram over there, and the Swamiji, one fine day, decided to clean up the place. He got everybody with plastic gloves and so on, and we pitched in. And you know, in about 2 hours, the place was completely clean. So it doesn't take much of an effort to come up with a culture that highlights cleanliness and believes in cleanliness. This is a mindset that we have to change. And it's a pity that, you know, this society, for all its greatness, has no respect at all for cleanliness, except in our homes. But when it comes to just your doorstep, you can dump all the muck over there and believe it will be taken care of. I think we need a change in mindset. You know, the very fact that in this day and age, after 2/3 of a century of independence, the bulk of the population still doesn't have sanitation facilities. I think it's a disgrace. It's a national disgrace. So we need to bring about a change, and I hope that will happen.
For the final set of questions, you may be aware that we are connected, you're probably seeing on the screen, with 2 universities. One is in Andhra Pradesh, Acharya University, and we are also connected online with Amrita University in Kerala. And Dr. Pachauri, there were so many people who wanted to be with you this morning that there is a whole room downstairs of tens of people that have come to be part of today's lecture. So for the final set of questions, I have 3 that have come from our colleagues downstairs that I will take in my capacity as the chair, I'll take the liberty of sharing with you. The first question is there any technology which is on similar lines of photosynthesis that can convert excess CO2 into glucose or sugar? Then we have a question from a colleague in the University of Delhi who says, I'm completely convinced with you on the issue of policies, regarding the mainstreaming of climate change into development. But what about implementation of those policies? Because perhaps, although India has very good environmental laws, what about the implementation of those? And then finally, quite a sensitive question. Fighting against climate change can enhance national incomes in the future. However, there is a belief now that NGOs who are fighting against changes in the climate are actually hampering GDP growth. And the colleague asks for your reflections.
Okay, I think these are all very good questions. Let me first talk about technology that harnesses photosynthesis. And let me say that one area which has enormous promise is the production of biofuels. Because essentially, if you use biomass and convert it into fuels, you're using photosynthesis, because biomass is produced by photosynthesis. In this country, there's anywhere from 400 to 500 tons of agricultural residue that's produced. And that could easily be converted. Of course, it'll take a lot of research and development and reaching a level of commercialization by which these technologies can be harnessed on a large scale. But there's huge potential. And I personally believe that human society, we talked about going back to what our ancestors did for their lifestyles. I think human society has to move towards a much greater bioeconomic future, where biomass for a variety of purposes becomes a stable source of supply, whether it's materials, fibers, energy. I think that would be a sustainable system, and that would be a system that can meet all our needs as we know them today. So I would say that this is a very good question, because photosynthesis is something that is an enormous and powerful resource that we really need to utilize. The implementation of laws, well, I really think we need a change in institutional arrangements. I mean, I was talking to the Minister for Water Resources yesterday, and I said that, you know, so much, and she also accepts that so much money is being spent in cleaning up our rivers, but it's a very centralized, bureaucratized approach. I mean, unless this becomes a movement of the people and communities by the rivers, living by the side of the rivers, get involved, we're not going to see any action. Similarly, when it comes to implementation of laws, I really think we have to get empowered groups at the local level. And you know, some of them will probably create distortions. But overall, I think the environment is something that has to come closer to the people. And if they're able to implement the laws and make sure that they become responsible for implementation, to the extent that they also become whistleblowers when somebody is not doing something right, you will not see a major change, because there's only so much that governments can do. This has to be through the involvement of all stakeholders. And how do we bring about that change? I think that's a political challenge, which I hope all of us, not just the government, all of us are able to bring about a change in. NGOs hampering economic growth. Let me say there are NGOs and NGOs. I know several who are doing remarkable work at the grassroots level. I can mention so many of them. They don't wave any flags. They don't create movements that get headlines. But they're doing sound and solid work in a very silent way. So, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And again, let me say that we need to define what kind of growth and development we want. If there's an NGO that's raising its voice against the kind of growth that we have currently and has valid reasons for doing so, I would salute them. So therefore, we cannot possibly tar everyone with the same brush. There's a huge range of NGOs in this country, some of which are doing absolutely outstanding work. And please, let's not dismiss them. That would be a fatal mistake that a democratic society like this country can ill afford. And therefore, I don't think we should get carried away in this nonsensical debate. Yeah. Thank you.
I hope everyone joins me in thanking Dr. Pachauri, not only for a brilliant speech, but for taking so many of our questions and answering them with such passion and insight. For the final part of today, we would like to have Ayumi Fujino, who is the head of UNIDO, give a vote of thanks. UNIDO is, on behalf of the UN family in India, the coordinator and facilitator of our campaign here to bring sustainable energy for all. And it's been under her very determined and dynamic leadership that we've had the public lecture today and are doing a number of other things to promote the 4 A's. Ayumi.
On behalf of the UN country team in India, and particularly the task team for Sustainable Energy for All, which I have honored to lead with other agencies, I would like, first of all, thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for your very passionate, enlightening, insightful speech and lecture. And then we are very, very grateful for your very enthusiastic involvement in the dialogue for promoting this issue in India, but also globally. And then in our case, in our UNIDO's case, we also have a big privilege to work with you, globally also, but also in India. I thank you very much. My thanks also goes to Liz Grande, Miss Liz Grande, whose leadership has been the real driving force for coming up today's lecture. But also, I think today's lecture is really giving us a good impetus to go ahead among UN agencies and with government and private sector NGOs. So without her support, we couldn't really have made it. So I would like to thank you. Having said that, I just would like to go back to the one issue of the UNCT initiative. I just would like to give you the gist of it. We have been working on this Sustainable Energy for All in India since 2013. And then I think you have in your folder, there is one publication, compendium, which talks about what we have been discussing, and then in which you can find the 12 UN agencies involved in this. But we are not really going to limit ourselves to the only part of our UN sister agencies. We have tried to work with every UN agencies for this issue. And then, as a result of this discussion, and then today's maybe this public lecture, we are going to further promote the activities in 4 cross-cutting areas. One is the livelihood, and second is the natural resource management. Third is health, and then fourth is sanitation. These are the areas we, United Nations country team in India, would like to pursue within the framework of sustainable energy for all from now. And then I also would like to say the sustainable energy for all itself has a huge agenda, as you can hear from the Dr. Pachauri's lecture. So we are really going to start basically the first objective, which is promote the universal access to the modern energies. We may really touch upon all the rest, but first let us start with this energy access issue. That's why we came to these 4 A's. The first is accessibility, and second is the availability, and third is the affordability. I'm not really going to go into detail, because I'm sure that most of them have been very much captured by the lecture of Dr. Pachauri and then all those examples he was really giving. But I would like to emphasize here that 4th A, which we came up with the accountability, which we would like to share with all of you, that who is really going to be made accountable to really achieve the objective of this sustainable energy for all. And then, of course, UN country team and UN agency in India are not the only one, of course not. So UN, together with the government, we would like to work together for the endorsement or more proactive involvement of dialogue on how actually sustainable energy for all can be implemented together. And then for this, as you well know, 2013 UN Human Development Index, India is ranked 136th out of 186 countries, being among one of those countries which have reached the medium development. But as you can hear from the public lecture today, I'm sure, and you are convinced now, that the energy issue is one of the maybe key element which can improve this human index issue of the current status of India, and then promote India to the socio-economic and then, of course, energy efficient and the energy sufficient country. So having said that, UN country team is going to really work together with the government, and then also hopefully with the private sector participation, and then academia, so that we can really equip ourselves with various policy measures, various analytical skills, and then background. So we would like to contribute to this, of course, the poverty alleviation, but really to try to find out one of the business models, let's say, to work together for this issue in India. Having said that, I would like to conclude. I would like to refer to your wording, Dr. Pachauri. Energy is, in its various forms, having something to do with human life and human activities. So it's all for us. Thank you very much.
Once again, we would like to thank everyone for being with us and hope that you will join us for lunch outside. Thank you.